Welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 195, and I am the show's host, Kyle. On this episode, I'm going to be discussing the wars in Yemen and Afghanistan. In Yemen, you have the Saudi-backed forces starting a military operation that is directed towards the Port of Hodeida. And in Afghanistan, you have the Taliban making gains in their annual Spring Offensive. For those of you who want to share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org. For those of you who listen to the show on a somewhat regular basis, you'll know that the situation in Yemen is one of the worst humanitarian situations in the world. 7 to 8 million people on the brink of starvation. 22 million of the 28 million Yemenis are in need of humanitarian assistance. 400,000 children are severely malnourished and are at risk of starving to death, and children are starving to death seemingly every day right now in Yemen. You have a brutal and bloody civil war there that has been fought, at least for the past couple of years, more or less to a stalemate. You have a Saudi-led air war with the United States, the United Arab Emirates, and the Egyptians, and the Sudanese as well, in coalition with them. The United States not only sells the critical weapons for Saudi Arabia to wage this war, but they also provide the needed maintenance on the airplanes, the logistical support to carry out these missions, and as well as mid-air refueling that makes many of these missions and bombing missions possible. And then the United States also helps to enforce the Saudi blockade of Yemen. A recent article by Scott Paul, who is a humanitarian worker, outlined the conditions that Saudi Arabia lays on the blockade and what they allow to get through and what they don't. Well, they're supposed to, I'm pretty sure, just allow aid ships in, and you would think that, the International Red Cross is a pretty standard organization, and you could count that they're not smuggling in Iranian missiles into Yemen or anything like that. And so you could just let their ships through, but that's not what's going on. They're inspecting all ships. If they find any contraband on the ship whatsoever, then they're, do re-inspections of the ship and stuff like that. And remember, there's guys that work on the ship that probably don't make all that much money or have, possibly even friends or family in Yemen. And, maybe they're trying to smuggle in something, and it's certainly not a rocket or a missile, made by the Iranians. It's just something that, a civilian item that Saudi Arabia happens to have on the contraband list. Now, Saudi Arabia also has stopped any cargo shipping containers from entering into the Port of Hodeida, which is the only port that services about 80% of the Yemeni people that lived in the Houthi-controlled areas. Now, if you just look at a map of Yemen, it looks like Saudi Arabia controls most of the country, or the Saudi-backed government controls most of the country. However, large portions of that are pretty much empty desert, but of that more or less empty desert, Al-Qaeda and ISIS control some pretty large chunks of it. However, most of the population is centered in the coastal areas and the more northern coastal areas as well. And so I think the 2 or 3 most populous provinces of Yemen are in the Houthi-controlled areas, Sana'a being one and Hodeida being the next. Now, at the start of the war on Yemen, Saudi Arabia actually bombed the existing cranes at the Port of Hodeida, but the United States pretty quickly offered up 4 replacement cranes, and these were movable cranes, I guess. So if Saudi Arabia had planned to bomb the port again, you could move the cranes out of the way. But Saudi Arabia blocked the entrance to those cranes to Yemen for well over a year. However, those cranes have been delivered, but since there's no cargo containers allowed on the ships, I think the cranes aren't all that effective in that they're not big enough to really be the replacements for the large permanent cranes that once existed at the port there. And again, and that's when there's cargo to actually bring into the port, because so much of it has been blocked off. At times there's been a complete blockade of Yemen where they even blocked humanitarian food from entering the country. Right now they pretty much block all commercial trade from entering the Port of Hodeida. And this has created a situation where when people even have the money to buy food and don't necessarily need to be on humanitarian assistance receiving food, there's just no food to buy. So there's a large concern that because, even the limited cargo that comes into Hodeida, it's still a very, very important port to serving a large portion of the country, that, if this port gets shut down, or, if the city comes under siege and the cargo isn't able to leave the city and go other areas, because of course, even if you have like this offloaded by humanitarian workers and then they drive their humanitarian vehicles to the other portions of Yemen to distribute this aid to make sure that it's not going to the Houthi fighters, then I think you're still in a position where if there's a lot of fighting going on around Hodeida, that you're really going to shut down and slow that process. Now, one other note in the article that I'll link to in the show notes page, the Scott Paul article, that I think is worth noting and does cut against that this would be a problem uniquely felt in the north of Yemen, is that about 80% of the cargo that enters the Port of Aden, which is the southern city of Yemen and is actually controlled now by southern separatists, but once by the Saudi-backed government of Yemen. 80% of that cargo ends up in the north of Yemen anyways, but I'm sure it's much more expensive to get it further, and you have to go through more battle lines and stuff like that, probably paying more taxes, more goes to fighters, less goes to people. But the point in this, the U.S. support is going to be more critical than ever. The United States is looking at preparing a new multi-billion-dollar, I believe, arms sale to the Saudis and the Emiratis for precision-guided munitions, which, of course, many of them will be used in Yemen to further kill these civilians, and possibly even used in the siege of the Port of Hodeida that could, push those 7 to 8 million people who are on the brink of famine. And, this, as Scott Horton explains, doesn't mean that, 400,000 Yemeni people will starve to death. It means 400,000 5-year-old children will, be the ones, or, it's the children that die from the starvation and the deprivation. The people who have come of age are, they have the bodies and the immune systems to fight it off, but, these kids will be the ones that really suffer. And imagine what it must feel like for a 5-year-old kid to have no understanding of why they, feel so much, hunger pain all day, every day until they just drop dead. So with that upcoming arms sale, it's another chance, though, to spin this in a more positive way. For the United States and, the non-interventionist types like myself and, maybe a Rand Paul and a Bernie Sanders in Congress, to go out, made some noise about this brutal Saudi war in Yemen and see if we could do something to at least stop the U.S. involvement in it. Now, I've argued in the past on the show, and I still think this holds more or less true, that if the United States withdrew their support, just, the maintenance on the airplanes, the logistical support, the support for the blockade, and the mid-air refueling, this would really, really limit Saudi Arabia's ability to carry out this war in Yemen. And maybe they could still carry out some bombing campaigns, and they could continue to fund Sudanese mercenaries to go and fight for whatever pro-Saudi government they want to put in place in South Yemen. However, they won't be able to carry out that brutal war they are now. And furthermore, if we could, stop selling them the bombs, then they would stop, it would be much harder to carry out bombings without bombs, right? And, if you look, it is the U.S. made bombs that are being used in these war crimes. That wedding that was recently bombed, I believe it was a Raytheon bomb that was found at the scene, 20 people at least, including the bride and 16 or so children, murdered by a U.S.-made bomb by Saudi Arabia, but they flew a U.S.-made plane. The U.S. helped coordinate the flight path. The U.S. refueled the plane on the way. So another developing story in Yemen that I've talked about a little bit, but it's the UAE occupation of the country, and their proxy force in Yemen is a little bit different than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is using a man by the name of Hadi, not saying that he's president of Yemen, although I believe he's spent most of his time as president living in Saudi Arabia. But he doesn't even control the capital city of Yemen anymore. The Southern Separatists do is one name that I've heard for these guys, and they're basically a breakaway group of Yemenis who believe that Yemen should be two countries, the North and the South Yemen. And I believe these are socialists, who believe in, Marxist style of government. And you often hear Scott Horton cite, seeing this YouTube video of a Yemeni guy, I believe, with an AK-47 saying Viva Hugo Chavez. Now, it's an interesting note that I picked up in a Reuters article recently, is that these Southern Separatists, when they were chased out of Yemen in 1994, went to southern Lebanon and stayed with Hezbollah until 2015 when they were offered a better deal by the Emiratis. However, a lot of times you hear that the international community, Nikki Haley at the United Nations, Israel, Saudi Arabia will make the claim that that the Houthis, who are the militia in northern Yemen that control a large portion of the country, are backed by Iran through Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. However, if you had this group who, I don't know how opposed to the Houthis they are, but are certainly fighting on the side of the coalition that's been bombing the Houthis every day for the past 3 years, just spent over a decade living with Hezbollah, then you would have to think that, all these alleged allegations of Hezbollah, you at least have to look at a possible another source for that. All right. So I think that about wraps up my discussion of Yemen. Hopefully when the State Department submits the proposed weapons sale to the Saudis and the Emiratis, we could get some senators on board to make a big deal of this again and, try to bring a lot of attention and expose this war in Yemen. All right, on to Afghanistan. The Taliban are fighting their, what's become an annual spring offensive, where in the spring they kind of restart the fighting season. They go back out, take arms up against the Americans. Now, on the last show, I had said that it didn't seem like there was a large uptick in violence since the Taliban had announced the start of their spring offensive, but I think I was a little bit off on that. While the Taliban certainly seemed to fight more through the winter of 2017, 2018 than they had in past years where there was a real lull in fighting. There's been several high-profile attacks through the past winter and pretty frequent Taliban attacks on Afghan army outposts and, other Afghan military sites. However, in a single week now, we had 100 Afghan soldiers killed by the Taliban, or ISIS, I believe, is counted here as well. You had 2 district headquarters seized by the Taliban, and now Farah City, which is the capital of the Farah province, which I believe is one of the neighboring provinces to Helmand in, I guess that'd be western Afghanistan, is under attack and mostly controlled by the Taliban. This is a good time to note that I am recording this show about 2 days before it airs, so it's possible that the Afghan army has now come back in and kicked out the Taliban. However, it does appear that the Taliban are threatening to capture this city from the Afghan government. I do believe there is a military base nearby, and the article I read did mention that there was close air support by US A-10s. So it does look like, there's going to be plenty of military support for the Afghan army if they are, able to carry out a mission to retake the city. If you'll remember, I think in 2016 and in 2017, the Taliban were able to, chase out the Afghan army in Kunduz, a city in more northeastern Afghanistan. However, the Afghan army, within a matter of, I think both times, a couple of weeks, was able to recapture the city from the Taliban. So, just want to clear that up because I think on the last show I did undersell a little bit the amount of violence the Taliban were inflicting in their spring offensive so far this year. Want to touch on Iraq just with the elections there. It was the Sadr bloc. This is Mohammed al-Sadr, I believe, a bloc who is kind of a nationalist Iraqi, and I'll get into that in a second, took a plurality of seats in the Iraqi parliamentary election, and Patrick Cockburn describes him as the man who will play kingmaker in the upcoming elections for a new prime minister of Iraq. Don't have a clear idea of who that might be yet, but it's important to know kind of just al-Sadr is somebody who doesn't really want either the Iranians or the United States to have a large role in rebuilding Iraq. One of the things he ran on was kind of almost a Trumpian-like line, saying that the corrupt people have bled the wealth from this country for a long time. I'm going to look to rebuild this country, and the fight against ISIS is over. He did have troops that, fought, or militia fighters loyal to al-Sadr fought against ISIS. It's also important to note that, this man has been a long-time adversary of the United States. I don't know if enemy is exactly the right word. At one point, or I think at 2 points actually, the United States during the, Iraq war, the second one, had him, surrounded and at one point was under house arrest by the United States. And I think he was at least a part of the kind of Shia resistance to the United States in 2006, 2007. And, a lot of times the folks on the right and on Fox News will overplay the amount of violence that these groups inflicted on the United States soldiers. But I think about 500 of the 4,500 U.S. soldiers that have died in Iraq died at the hands of those fighters. As we move forward, this Iraqi election for prime minister will play out, and we'll kind of see what the power sharing agreements are or whatever here. But the United States is now in a kind of interesting position where the leadership of Iraq isn't somebody that we really support and isn't somebody that's too fond of the United States, and yet we have these plans to rebuild the Iraqi army. And so Jason Ditz lays out a pretty good case as to why this is the time the United States should just kind of leave Iraq. They elected their new nationalist government, and let them have their country. We've tried in Iraq enough times. It's time to let them have their chance at that. And I'll link to that article in the show notes page as well. North Korea stuff. It looks like Kim Jong-un has postponed talks with South Korea over concerns of United States aerial war games that they carry out with South Korea. These involve the B-2 nuclear capable bombers and F-22s. There's a really good analysis of this by the Ron Paul and Daniel McAdams on the Liberty Report that I'll link to in the show notes page for those of you who want to get a little bit more information on this. And we'll see how the situation plays out. I think, the hawks and the warmongers who don't want peace, and then the left who doesn't want Donald Trump to, have a victory here, are going to kind of play up the point. Oh, see, now we see that, North Korea was just looking for concessions from the other side. And, as soon as he can, he's going to back out on this. But if you look, the other side really hasn't made all that many concessions. I mean, the South Koreans dismantled some speakers, and that's pretty much it. And it's, the North Koreans that have agreed not to do nuclear testing. And as far as I'm aware, are still planning on shutting down their nuclear testing sites. I also want to just update real quick on the Iran nuclear deal. It looks like the Iranian foreign minister met with his European counterparts, UK, France, and Germany, to talk about saving the deal. He said talks are positive at the start. One of the problems is I think a lot of the companies aren't really looking to do business in Iran because the United States is just so hostile. I think Airbus said that, not even to look for waivers for them because, it's kind of pointless at this point just because they do so much business with the United States. The United States has added new sanctions to Iran, including sanctioning the head of the Iranian central bank. And so the United States is, I think, taking real efforts right now to kill the Iran nuclear deal in its entirety and not allow Europe to make its own decisions and stay within that agreement, which is really disappointing because, Trump got to put sanctions on Iran. If that's what he wants to do, that's what he could do. There's, really no accomplishment or success to it because the current Iran nuclear deal prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon or conducting a secret nuclear weapon program. And so if the Europeans remain in that deal and the United States is still able to sanction Iran, I don't see how that's something that Donald Trump should really be able to complain about, but he's going to do it. Anyways, there's also one more thing I want to talk about, and that's just kind of fallout from the Israeli massacre of Palestinians in Gaza on the 14th of May there. I think massacre is a pretty appropriate word. If you look at a massacre that, is well known in history, like the Boston Massacre, you'll see when you read the accounts that the colonists were throwing rots and stuff at, nothing that was going to kill the British soldiers, but they were throwing things at them. And so the British forces opened fire on unarmed people. And that's exactly what happened in Palestine. Anyways, Israel and Turkey have had diplomatic fallout and have kicked each other's envoys out of their countries. And Erdogan has, used this. Erdogan's the Turkish strongman who's now in charge of the country, has used this opportunity, I think, to, try to make himself a shepherd, especially of the Sunni population of the Middle East, by saying that, he stands up for the Palestinians, although it's yet to see, what he's actually doing to help out the people who are suffering there. At the UN, all the countries were giving their speeches on what happened here. They're going through their formal process of, I guess venting about it. Nothing ever really gets done. It's not like they actually ever prevent any suffering. However, when the Palestinians were giving their account, Nikki Haley walked out of the room. She's a child, absolutely a child. And this is the United States diplomat, the United Nations. It's absolutely disgusting. I wish she would quit. The other thing that happened is the United States vetoed a resolution that would investigate these Israeli war crimes, or I don't even know, crimes against humanity of the Gazans, because you really can't call it a war when one side is throwing stones and the other side has tanks and F-35s. But again, this is where we are. But for more on that, I again suggest check out the last episode, the show 194. Will Porter talked about the Nakba catastrophe day And then we kind of just talked about the brutal situation right now in Gaza. All right, that's where I wrap up the show for today. I hope you all enjoyed the shows this week. Again, this show was recorded a couple days before it was released, so if there's any big news that I'm not covering, sorry about that, but due to some scheduling stuff, I had to do it this way. For those of you who want to share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. The Facebook page is Libertarian Union, at KYAAALE on Twitter. YouTube is Immersion News. BitChute is Immersion News. The brand new news website, of course, is immersionnews.com. Thanks everybody for checking out my work and listening to my show, and really appreciate it for those of you who take the time to share it.